An elderly woman was walking her dog one day when she noticed a tiny rusty door in the trunk of an old oak tree. What she found inside made her burst into tears. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. The storm had come in the night, tearing through the Alabama countryside with a fury that made the windows of Mylon Jones's farmhouse tremble in their frames. The rain had drummed on the tin roof for hours, a relentless tattoo that blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness. When morning finally arrived, a silence felt almost unnatural, thick, heavy, and full of the scent of wet earth and splintered wood. Mylon stood by the kitchen window, a mug of lukewarm coffee in her hands, and stared out at what the wind had left behind. Her property, 10 acres of stubborn red soil and patchy pasture land, looked as if it had survived a war. Fallen branches littered the yard, the chicken coop's roof had half collapsed, and the old fence along the western line leaned like a row of tired men. But the house itself still stood solid and dry, and that was enough. At 60, Mylon had learned to accept the world's cruelties with the same quiet endurance she used for her own grief. Her husband, Marcus, had been gone 20 years, taken by a roadside bomb in Vietnam when she was barely 40. Since then, life had become a series of small duties: mending, planting, feeding, fixing. She was proud of her self-reliance. The neighbors called her tough, and she supposed that was true, though she knew toughness was just another name for surviving with no one to help you. The morning air was damp and heavy when she stepped outside. Her rubber boots sank into the soft mud, and the grass glistened with water. Rusty, her old hound, followed behind her, sniffing the ground with lazy curiosity. Together, they walked the perimeter, checking the damage. The sky was still pale and bruised from the storm, the sun not yet strong enough to burn through the mist. Mylon stopped at the barn, tested the hinges on the door, and made mental notes of what needed repair: the fence, the gutter, the chicken wire. Life on a farm left no room for idleness. Storms came and went, but chores always returned. When she reached the far edge of the property, where the ground sloped down toward the creek, she paused. There stood the old oak, a giant that had been there longer than any living soul in the county. Its roots coiled and twisted above the soil like the knuckles of an ancient hand. It had weathered more storms than she could count, and every year it shed another limb or scar, yet still it stood, stubborn, immovable, almost defiant. But this morning, something was different. The rain had washed away the top layer of earth around the base of the tree, revealing a hollow among the roots. She bent down, squinting through the wet strands of her hair. At first, she thought it was a rock, or perhaps an old tin can buried long ago. But as she brushed away the mud with her gloved fingers, she saw a glint of something metallic, not dull like a can, but small and deliberate, shaped by human hands. A door. It was tiny, no taller than her hand, and almost completely swallowed by the bark. The metal was rusted and rough, the outline barely visible where the wood had grown around it, and there in the center was a small padlock, eaten through with rust, but unmistakably real. Mylon straightened up, frowning. She had lived on this land for nearly 3 decades, had walked this stretch of ground hundreds of times, and never once had she noticed anything like that. She knelt again, touched the lock, and felt the cold bite of iron against her fingertips. "Who in the world?" she murmured under her breath. Rusty sniffed the spot and whined softly as if sensing her unease. Mylon stood still, listening to the wind move through the wet leaves. The quiet felt deeper than usual, as though the world had paused to see what she would do next. It had to be some old thing left behind by a child or a worker from long ago. Maybe an old tobacco tin nailed to the roots by some farmer who'd forgotten it. And yet, the craftsmanship of that little door, its shape, the way it fit flush against the bark, didn't look careless. It looked purposeful. She brushed more mud away, revealing the faint hinge line. Her curiosity flared, but a strange sense of respect, or maybe reluctance, made her stop. She felt, absurdly, as though she were intruding. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She made her supper, fed the chickens what was left of the dry feed, and settled into her creaking armchair with a blanket and a cup of tea. Outside, the world was still soaked and quiet. She told herself it was foolish to worry about a piece of metal in a tree, but her mind kept circling back to it. The color of the rust, the way it seemed almost hidden on purpose. She had seen her share of odd things in these woods, old fences swallowed by vines, forgotten gravestones sinking into the soil, even the shell of a burned wagon half buried by time. But this was different. A locked door in a living oak wasn't something nature made by accident. Someone had built it, and someone had locked it. As she sat by the window, she let her mind wander to the years when she and Marcus were newly married. He had planted a pecan tree near the porch, insisting that one day their children would swing from its branches. That dream had never come to pass, and the tree now stood crooked and fruitless, a living monument to plans that never ripened. Maybe that was why the oak unsettled her. Maybe it wasn't just curiosity, it was memory stirring. Before bed, she took out her old flashlight and placed it on the table by the door. She found her pair of heavy work gloves and her small crowbar. She didn't tell herself she was planning to go back, but she knew she would. When dawn came, the mist still hung low over the fields. Mylan tied her hair back, put on her denim jacket, and stepped out. The air smelled of damp soil and moss. Rusty trotted ahead, tail wagging lazily. The walk to the oak took only a few minutes, but it felt longer that morning. Every sound, the distant hum of a tractor, the drip of water from leaves, seemed amplified. The tree stood as she had left it, massive and solemn. The small door was there, half concealed in shadow. She crouched down, tracing its edge with her glove. The lock looked ancient, fused to the hinge by rust, but still intact. She hesitated, then leaned closer. The bark around it felt strangely warm, as if it had absorbed the sunlight despite the morning chill. She pressed the flat end of the crowbar against the lock and applied pressure. The metal didn't budge. She frowned, repositioned, and tried again. The first snap echoed through the still air, a brittle, dry sound like a bone cracking. The lock split cleanly in two. She froze, half expecting something to happen, though she couldn't have said what. When nothing did, she set the broken lock aside and pulled gently on the little handle. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, flakes of metal fallen into the soil. Inside was darkness. She leaned forward, shining the flashlight into the hollow. The beam caught only dust and cobwebs at first, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a small shape nestled inside, a box, square and dull, wrapped in something that might once have been cloth. Mylan's heartbeat quickened. She reached in carefully and pulled it out. It was heavier than she expected, the metal cool and solid in her hands. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her reflection faintly visible in the tarnished surface. Then she wrapped it in her jacket and rose. The tree said nothing. The wind stirred the branches overhead, sending a few raindrops tumbling down onto her shoulders. She stood there for several minutes, her pulse loud in her ears. She had uncovered something that had been hidden for who knew how long, decades perhaps. She looked back toward her farmhouse, half visible through the thinning mist. The sight of its roof line, familiar and unchanging, grounded her. This was her land. Whatever this was, it belonged here now, just as she did. She turned and began the walk home, the box tucked carefully under her arm. That night, long after sunset, the farmhouse windows glowed faintly through the fog. Inside, Mylan sat at the kitchen table, the box before her, the flashlight casting a pale circle of light. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the lid. Then, slowly, she began to unwrap the brittle cloth. The contents glimmered faintly beneath a layer of dust. A photograph. A small cross. Something round and metallic. A button, maybe. And beneath them, a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Mylan touched the photo, brushing away the grime. The face of a man looked back at her, young, proud, dressed in a soldier's uniform. The edges were frayed, but his eyes were clear. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "George, I'll come back as soon as I can." Mylan sat very still, the words ringing in her mind. She didn't know this man, had never seen him, and yet something about that note, that promise, struck deep. She turned the photo over again, studying his features. The curve of his jaw, the faint smile. It all felt hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't place why. Rusty shifted near the door, letting out a low, contented sigh. The house creaked softly in the cooling night air. Mylan leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She felt suddenly, sharply aware of how many lives the land had seen before hers, how many loves and losses were buried under its surface. She had always thought of the farm as hers, as a place she'd earned through labor and loss, but now it seemed like something else, an inheritance from strangers, from time itself. She didn't yet know what the little door had opened inside her, but she knew she couldn't close it again, and as the last light of her flashlight dimmed, Mylan sat in the dark, listening to the whisper of the wind outside, and wondered whose secret she was now keeping, and why it felt, somehow, like her own. Morning came late to Mylan's farm, the sun hiding behind a thin veil of cloud that diffused the light into a silvery haze. The air still smelled faintly of rain and wet bark. She hadn't slept much. The discovery in the oak had haunted her through the night, flickering in her dreams like an unanswered question. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph, those calm, steady eyes of the soldier named George staring back at her from across decades of silence. The words on the back, "I'll come back as soon as I can," echoed in her mind, a promise caught somewhere between hope and tragedy. She sat by the kitchen table again, the box still in front of her, though she had already returned its contents to order. Everything about it felt deliberate, the folded letter, the neat arrangement of the objects, the care that had gone into hiding them. Someone had wanted this little memorial to be safe, and she, without knowing it, had broken the lock and trespassed into another life. After finishing her coffee, she wrapped the box carefully in an old towel and tucked it into her canvas satchel. She needed air. The morning was too still, her thoughts too heavy. Rusty trotted to the door before she even called, his tail thumping against the floor as if sensing another walk ahead. Together, they stepped outside into the cool quiet of the fields. The path to the oak was soft beneath her boots, the ground still damp from the storm. A thin mist hovered low, drifting between the trunks. When she reached the tree, she stopped and simply looked at it for a while. The door in its roots now gaped open like a wound. Without the lock, it no longer felt hidden but exposed, vulnerable to the world. Mylan crouched down and ran her hand along the bark. It was coarse, rough with age, but alive. She could feel the faint pulse of sap beneath her fingers, like the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. She set her satchel beside her and peered into the hollow again. The darkness inside was shallow now that she had disturbed it. Her flashlight from the day before lay nearby, still faintly smudged with mud. The niche was small, barely big enough to hold the tin box and a few handfuls of dust. No other secrets waited inside. Yet the air felt charged with something intangible, an awareness, maybe, or simply the weight of time. She thought of how many seasons this tree had stood through, how many storms it had endured, and how absurdly brief her own lifetime felt beside it. Someone had chosen this oak carefully. It wasn't just any tree. It was a witness. She replaced the door, pushing it gently until the hinge settled back into its groove. The old metal creaked softly, a tired sigh from another century. She hadn't brought a new lock yet, though the thought had crossed her mind. Instead, she pressed the door closed with the heel of her palm and whispered almost instinctively, "Stay safe now." When she returned home, the house seemed quieter than usual. Even the refrigerator's hum felt distant. She placed the box on the table again, sat opposite it, and forced herself to open the folded paper she hadn't yet dared to read. The ink was faint, the words barely legible, written in a hurried, looping hand. She had to tilt the paper toward the window light to make them out. "My dearest, if you're reading this, it means you found our place. I kept this here because I needed to believe you would come back to me, even when they said you wouldn't. I couldn't bury you without proof. So I kept waiting. Maybe one day someone will open this and remember that we loved, once, that we were here." There was no signature, only a small dark stain in the corner. Perhaps water, perhaps something else. Mylan felt her throat tighten. She placed the letter down carefully and looked again at the photograph. George's uniform was American, World War II by the cut of it, the kind worn by young men who'd been promised glory and came home, if at all, as folded flags. She leaned back and let out a slow breath. There was no trace of fear in her now, only an ache of recognition. She, too, knew what it meant to wait for someone who wouldn't return. The years didn't dull that. They only quieted the noise around it. Her fingers brushed the cross that had been in the box. It was simple, worn smooth at the edges, probably something carried in a pocket for comfort. She held it in her palm until its coldness became familiar. By afternoon, she found herself restless. The house felt too small, too full of memories pressing in from all sides. She took her truck into town, the box wrapped in a cloth and resting beside her on the passenger seat. She wasn't sure what she planned to do, but she drove anyway. The main street of Willow Bend was quiet as always. One gas station, a feed store, a diner, and the squat red brick church where she taught Sunday school decades ago. She parked outside the church. Inside, the air was cool and dry, smelling faintly of dust and wax. Pastor Thompson, a kind man in his 70s, was polishing the pews. When he saw her, he smiled. "Mylan, haven't seen you here since Christmas service." "I came to look through the archives," she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "Do you still keep the old records here? The ones from before the war?" He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Downstairs in the storage room. They're not in the best shape, though. Dusty as a tomb." "That's all right," she said. The basement smelled of mildew and old paper. Mylan found a switch on the wall and a single bulb flickered to life. Rows of cardboard boxes lined the shelves, labeled in faded ink: births, baptisms, funerals. She began searching through them methodically, her fingers leaving small trails in the dust. It took nearly an hour before she found what she was looking for. In a box marked A 1940-1950, there were two fragile envelopes. One contained a photograph of a wedding that had never happened, the other held an obituary. Her breath caught as she read the name: George Reed, missing in action, 1944. Underneath was another record, written in a different hand. Elsie Carter, seamstress, unmarried, deceased, 1948. Buried in Willow Bend Cemetery. Mylan's heart gave a small, involuntary lurch. The surname Carter she knew well. That was the family who had owned this land before her parents bought it in the 70s, the same land where the oak still stood. She sank onto an old wooden stool, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. The story was beginning to take shape now, like a ghost resolving into focus. Not a haunting one, but a human story, simple and sorrowful. Elsie had loved a man who never came home. The box was her way of keeping him near, her proof against forgetting. Mylan imagined her sitting under that oak in the fading light, hiding the tin box in the roots with trembling hands. Maybe she'd planned to come back every year. Maybe she had, until she couldn't anymore. Upstairs, the church bell struck 3, the sound echoing faintly through the floorboards. Mylan folded the papers carefully, replaced them in the box, and turned off the light. On her way out, Pastor Thompson called after her. "Find what you were looking for?" She hesitated. "Yes," she said softly, "and something I didn't know I needed." Driving home, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The puzzle wasn't solved completely, but its outline was clear. She knew now whose hands had locked that little door. She also knew that what she'd found wasn't meant to be a mystery at all. It was meant to be remembered. The sun was lowering when she pulled into her driveway, washing the fields in gold. The oak stood in silhouette against the sky, its branches wide and full. She parked the truck and walked toward it, the satchel slung over her shoulder. At the base of the tree, she knelt and placed the box gently inside the hollow once more. She didn't wrap it in cloth this time. She left it open for a moment, looking at the photograph one last time. The young soldier's smile was faint but real, the kind of expression a person wears for someone they love. "George and Elsie," she whispered, saying their names aloud for the first time. They sounded right together, like two notes of the same chord. She laid the letter on top of the photo, placed the cross beside it, and then closed the lid. The metal clicked softly. Carefully, she pushed the little door shut, pressing it until it sat flush with the bark again. For a moment, she just knelt there, listening to the evening settle around her. The hum of crickets, the low rumble of the creek beyond the field, the sigh of wind through the grass. There was nothing mystical in it, only life continuing as it always had. But in that quiet, she felt a presence nonetheless, not of spirits, but of stories, of lives that had passed through the same soil she now called home. When she finally stood, the first stars were appearing faintly above the horizon. The world hadn't changed, and yet everything felt different. She looked at the oak one last time before turning back toward the farmhouse. Its shadow stretched long across the field, dark and steady, reaching almost to her doorstep. Inside, she washed her hands, made herself a simple supper, and sat down by the window with a small notebook. On the first page, she wrote only one line: Every piece of land keeps a memory. Then she closed the notebook and set it aside. That night she dreamed of rain again, but not the kind that destroyed. This time it was gentle, falling through sunlight, washing dust from leaves, seeping into roots. And beneath the oak, unseen, a small metal door remained closed, protecting what needed no longer to be hidden. When she woke before dawn, the world was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock on her wall. She poured herself a cup of coffee and went to the window. Outside, mist curled low over the fields, and the first light of day brushed the horizon in pale gold. The oak stood exactly where it had always stood, ancient and indifferent, yet somehow, it felt like a friend. The lock she had broken lay on her table, split in two, a tiny relic of the barrier she had crossed. She picked it up, ran her thumb over the corroded metal, and smiled faintly. Whatever secret that tree had once guarded was no longer buried. And though she didn't yet know what she would do with the story, she knew she wouldn't let it be forgotten. She set the broken lock on the windowsill, a small token of something ended and something begun. The day stretched out before her, quiet and open, like a page waiting to be written. She took a deep breath, feeling the air settle in her lungs, and for the first time in many years, she was not thinking about the past as something lost, but as something found. The morning after Mylan returned the box to the hollow, she awoke with a strange clarity, as though the rain-washed air outside had found its way into her lungs. For the first time in years, she rose before the alarm clock sounded, the faint blue of dawn still filtering through the curtains. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only between night and sunrise, when even the birds are waiting. She brewed coffee, the smell of it rich and grounding, and sat at her kitchen table, staring out toward the fields. The oak stood in the distance, just visible through the fog, solemn and unwavering, as if it had accepted her small act of reverence and now kept watch. Her hands rested around the mug, warm and still. She thought about what she had learned, about the names written in fading ink, George Reed and Elsie Carter, and how both lives had ended long before hers began. There was a peculiar peace in that thought, but also a lingering ache. Somewhere beneath her land, beneath the soil she'd plowed and sown for decades, lay the unmarked story of two people who had once felt everything she felt now: hope, fear, loss. The idea both humbled and unsettled her. Later that day, she drove back into town. The church's basement archives had given her names, but names were only the skeleton of history. She wanted to know the faces, the textures, the pulse of who they had been. The Willow Bend Historical Society was housed in an old library near the edge of town, a red brick building with ivy creeping up its sides, and the faint musty scent of old paper that clung even to the air outside. Inside, the light filtered through high windows in soft rectangles, illuminating rows of wooden tables and stacks of boxes labeled by decade. Mrs. Langford, the society's curator, recognized Mylan immediately. "I heard about your place after the storm," she said, adjusting her glasses as she led Mylan through the narrow aisles. "You came out of it better than most." "I suppose I did," Mylan replied. "I'm looking for some local history. The Carter family, particularly an Elsie Carter, lived near the creek before the war." Mrs. Langford raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She led her to a filing cabinet older than both of them. "You'll find most of the property records here. The Carters owned about 20 acres before the government expanded the railway line. The land changed hands several times after that." Mylan spent hours going through the documents, her fingers tracing names on brittle pages. She found a deed dated 1932 signed by Robert Carter, Elsie's father. Then another, undated, transferring ownership after his death. There was no mention of Elsie's life after 1944, only the notation, "No surviving heirs." The phrase sent a shiver through her. She could almost see the ink drying, the official hand that closed a story with a single line. In another box labeled Community Records, she found a faded newspaper clipping. Local seamstress mourns missing soldier. The headline was small, buried among market updates and weather forecasts. Beneath it was a grainy photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and dark curls pinned neatly at the sides. She was standing on the porch of a small cottage, holding something, a piece of fabric perhaps. The caption read, "Miss Elsie Carter continues to await word from her fiancé, George Reed, reported missing overseas." Mylan felt the words press into her chest. There was a loneliness in the woman's expression that was instantly familiar, a patience born of quiet despair. She recognized it because she had worn it herself once, long ago, when the telegram about Marcus arrived. She had waited too, though her waiting had ended with a folded flag and a grave marked by government-issued stone. She copied the clipping and folded it into her notebook. Then she turned another page and found something unexpected, a small photograph of the local school class from 1938. The caption listed the children's names, and among them was Elsie Carter, age 17. The photograph showed a row of bright faces standing before the same church she still attended, the same oak trees in the background now grown into giants. The past was no longer a shadow, but a presence taken shape. Each piece she uncovered fit into a quiet mosaic. She could almost hear the sound of Elsie's laughter, the hum of her sewing machine, the rustle of fabric under her hands. The weight of those invisible years filled the small reading room until Mylan had to stand and step outside into the sunlight just to breathe. Outside, the town was slow and drowsy under the afternoon heat. A train passed in the distance, its whistle echoing off the low hills, and for a moment she imagined George Reed among its passengers, returning at last. But the sound faded, and reality returned with it, the irrevocable truth that he had never come back, and that Elsie had died waiting. Driving home along the winding road, Mylan saw her own reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines on her face were deeper than she remembered, her hair streaked with silver. Time had written its own record across her features, but there was also something softer there, a light she hadn't seen in years. Curiosity, maybe, or purpose. The discovery had stirred something in her that wasn't sadness, but recognition, a sense of belonging to something larger than her own solitude. When she reached her property, the sun was dipping low, painting the fields in shades of amber. She parked the truck and walked the rest of the way to the oak. The air around it was cooler, shaded and still. She touched the bark gently, feeling its rough surface beneath her palm. The door remained closed as she had left it. She crouched down and whispered, "I know who you were now." The words weren't meant for anyone living. That evening, after feeding the chickens and tidying the porch, she pulled out an old shoebox from the closet. Inside were Marcus's letters from Vietnam, tied together with a frayed blue ribbon. She hadn't opened them in years. For the longest time, she couldn't bear to. But now she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. His handwriting was steady, looping, the same as she remembered. "If something happens to me, know that being away from you has been the hardest part." She smiled faintly at that. It was the same kind of promise George had written to Elsie. Different wars, different eras, same impossible hope. She read until her eyes blurred, and then she placed Marcus's letters beside the newspaper clipping of Elsie. The juxtaposition struck her with quiet force. Two women separated by decades, joined by the same kind of grief. Over the following days, Mylin found herself drawn to the oak as if it were a friend. She began to clear the area around it, pulling away weeds, collecting fallen branches, brushing the dirt smooth with a rake. It became a small ritual at dusk when the air cooled and the sky turned violet. Rusty often sat nearby, head resting on his paws, watching her with patient eyes. She didn't talk much, but sometimes she spoke to the air anyway, telling the unseen couple about the weather, about the town, about how the church still rang its bell every Sunday. The work was simple but steadying. She started to see her land differently, not as property to be maintained, but as a story to be remembered. She noticed how the wildflowers near the oak bloomed brighter after the rain, how the soil stayed damp longer under its shade. It felt, in an odd way, like the ground itself approved of her care. One afternoon, while tidying the shelves in her small study, she found an old map tucked inside a drawer, a hand-drawn survey from the early 1900s. It showed the property lines before the railway expansion, with the Carter homestead clearly marked. And there, in faded pencil, someone had drawn a small heart at the edge of the creek and written one word beside it. Us. Mylin's throat tightened as she traced the faint line with her finger. That single word carried an intimacy stronger than any signature. She understood then that the oak wasn't just a tree where Elsie had hidden her memories, it was where she and George had dreamed of their future, perhaps sitting beneath it, speaking of a life they would never have. As the days passed, Mylin's thoughts kept circling back to how easily time erased people like them. Ordinary folks whose love, pain, and resilience were never recorded in history books. Without someone to remember, their stories vanished into dust. The thought troubled her. She had always believed she was content living quietly, unseen, but now she began to wonder whether being remembered, even by a stranger, was the only kind of immortality any of them could hope for. That night, a summer storm rolled in again. The thunder was low and distant, like a slow drumbeat beyond the hills. Rain pattered against the windows, steady and soft. Mylin sat by the fire, the map spread across her knees. Rusty lay at her feet, his fur damp from an earlier walk. She thought about all the storms the oak must have endured, decades of lightning, wind, drought, and how it still stood. People, she realized, were not so different. They broke and healed and kept standing too, though their scars were invisible. Before going to bed, she stepped out onto the porch. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the air smelled of wet grass and earth. In the darkness, she could just make out the outline of the oak at the far edge of her land. The small door glinted faintly when the lightning flashed, a fleeting reminder of the secret it held. For a moment, she felt Marcus near, the way she sometimes did in quiet moments when memory and reality blurred. It wasn't a haunting, just the warmth of love that time couldn't quite erase. She whispered his name, then the names of the two strangers she had come to care about, George and Elsie, and felt them all connected, threads in the same tapestry of the past and present. When she went back inside, she found herself writing again. On a clean page in her notebook, she began to piece together what she had learned. It wasn't for anyone else yet. It was just her way of setting things in order, making sense of how lives intersected through the land. She wrote about the oak, about the storm that revealed the door, about the letters and photographs, and about the quiet dignity of two people who had loved without the world noticing. By the time she finished, dawn was breaking again, pale and tender over the horizon. She closed the notebook and placed it beside Marcus's letters, feeling something inside her settle. The past was no longer something buried. It was alive, breathing through the stories she carried. And as she watched the first rays of sunlight spill across the wet fields, she knew the next step would be to share what she had found, not just to honor them, but to remind others that every life, no matter how forgotten, leaves traces worth following. The following week brought a stillness to the air, the kind that precedes a change of season. The mornings were cooler now, and a faint silver mist hung over the fields until well after sunrise. Mylan noticed the difference first in the way her breath clouded faintly when she stepped out to feed the chickens, and then in the rustle of dry leaves along the fence line. The land was beginning its slow turn toward autumn, yet, for the first time in years, the change did not make her melancholy. There was a purpose in her days now, a quiet thread of intention that tied everything together. She spent much of her time thinking about the couple whose secret she had unearthed. The more she learned, the more real they became. No longer names on a page, but people whose lives had left an imprint on the same soil she tended every day. The oak tree, once just part of her landscape, had become something else entirely. It wasn't sacred, not in any mystical sense, but it held a kind of dignity that commanded respect. Sometimes she caught herself glancing toward it while working, half expecting to see a figure sitting under its branches. Her curiosity, though softened by reverence, hadn't faded. One afternoon, she decided to visit an old neighbor, Mr. Turner, who had lived in Willow Bend longer than anyone she knew. His farmhouse stood 3 miles down the dirt road, weathered and crooked but alive with memory. He was nearly 90 and spent most days on his porch, his chair facing the open fields as though keeping watch over time itself. When she arrived, he greeted her with a smile that deepened the folds in his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, "if it isn't Mylan Jones. You haven't come visitin' in years." "I've been meaning to," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside him. "Life just has a way of slipping by." He nodded knowingly, spitting a sunflower seed shell into the grass. "Ain't that the truth? You still up there on the Carter land?" The question caught her off guard. She had never thought of it as the Carter land. It had always been hers, bought by her father after the war, but of course that was what the old families called it. "Yes," she said, "still there." He looked at her for a long moment, then chuckled softly. "My daddy used to tell stories about that place. Said there was a girl once, Elsie Carter. Sweet thing, worked down at the dress shop in town, lived alone after her folks passed." Mylan felt her chest tighten. Did he ever mention what happened to her? He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. Only that she was waiting for a man who never came home. A soldier, I reckon. Folks said she used to sit by that big oak at the edge of the property, reading letters. My daddy always said you could hear her singing sometimes when the sun went down. After she died, nobody wanted that land for a long while. Some said it felt wrong to build there. I don't put much stock in superstition, but I will say that tree of hers still stands like it's guarding something. Mylan listened in silence, her throat dry. She didn't tell him about the box, or the photograph, or the letter. Some secrets weren't meant to be shared so carelessly, but his words settled in her mind like roots taken hold. She thanked him, promised to visit again, and drove home with the windows rolled down, the wind tangling her hair. The sky was streaked with pink when she reached her land. The oak loomed at the far edge, its branches dark against the fading light. She walked out to it, not to search or pry this time, but simply to be there. The ground beneath her boots was soft, faintly damp from the morning dew. She sat down at the base of the tree, resting her back against the trunk, and looked up through the canopy. The leaves rustled gently, whispering in a language older than words. For a long while she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly, as though addressing both the living and the dead. "I found someone who remembers you," she said. "You're not forgotten." The words surprised her by how much comfort they gave, not just to the ghosts of others, but to herself. As the days passed, she found herself returning to the oak more often, sometimes bringing a small thermos of tea, sometimes just sitting with her notebook open on her lap. The air there seemed different, calmer, heavier, filled with a kind of grounded peace she couldn't find anywhere else. It wasn't mystical, it was simply the feeling of connection, the realization that she was part of a continuum that stretched far beyond her own brief lifetime. One morning, as she sat there, a pair of children wandered up from the creek, siblings from the neighboring farm, their boots muddy and their laughter bright. They stopped short when they saw her. "Miss Jones," the older one said shyly, "our daddy said this tree's real old. Is it true somebody died here?" Mylan smiled faintly. "No," she said, "no one died here, but someone lived here once, and they loved this place very much." The girl nodded solemnly, as though that answer were even more important than the one she'd expected. They stayed to help her gather fallen branches, asking questions about trees and storms, and whether the land really could remember things. Mylan told them that it could, because people remember, and people belong to the land. When they ran off again, she watched them disappear into the tall grass, their voices echoing faintly. Something about that small exchange left her heart lighter. Later that evening, she brought a small wooden box of her own to the oak. It wasn't elaborate, just something she'd made years ago in a woodworking class Marcus had encouraged her to take. Inside, she placed 3 objects. One of his old army patches, a pressed violet from her garden, and a scrap of paper on which she'd written, "All things endure when someone remembers." She set the box into a shallow spot near the roots, not to hide it, but to leave it there, part of the earth. In doing so, she realized that she was not just tending to someone else's memory, she was tending to her own. The oak had become a mirror, reflecting back to her the parts of herself she'd buried beneath work and habit. Grief, love, hope, they all lived there, intertwined like the roots below her. A week later, she returned to Mr. Turner to bring him some of her garden's late tomatoes. He was on the porch again, rocking slowly. They talked for a long time about old times, about the way the town had changed, and how the new families didn't know the stories of the land. At one point, he said, "You ever think about writing it all down? These things fade, you know. Folks forget." Mylan smiled. "I've started," she said. "I'm not sure what it'll be yet. Maybe just a story for whoever comes after me." He nodded approvingly. "That's how you keep folks alive, not in stone, but in words." When she left, the sun was setting behind the hills, bathing everything in a soft orange light. She drove slowly, windows open, listening to the hum of crickets and the rhythmic thump of her tires on the dirt road. The fields were golden with late summer grass, and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. That night she dreamed again, though this time it wasn't of storms or soldiers. She dreamed of roots, vast and tangled beneath the earth, connecting everything, trees, people, places. In the dream, she could hear faint voices, not speaking, but humming like a memory too deep for words. When she woke, the sensation lingered, not eerie but peaceful, like a song fading into morning light. She went to the oak before breakfast. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that hinted at the first frost not far away. The children had left a few wildflowers there, their stems tucked between the roots. Mylan smiled. She crouched down, brushed the dirt from the little door, and felt the cool metal beneath her fingertips. "They know about you now," she murmured. "They'll keep your story safe, too." Standing there, she realized something she hadn't before. The oak's strength wasn't in its size or age, but in its ability to endure without claiming ownership of what it sheltered. It had outlived storms, droughts, fires, and people. Yet it still stood, holding quietly the traces of every life that had passed beneath it. And in that moment, Mylan understood that she was part of that endurance, not by blood or name, but by choice. As she turned to leave, a soft wind rustled the leaves, sending a few tumbling down around her. One landed on her shoulder, bright gold against her denim jacket. She smiled and let it fall, feeling an inexplicable sense of completion. That evening, sitting on her porch, she began to draft the first true lines of the story she would one day share. It wasn't about ghosts or lost love, not really. It was about remembering, about how the earth keeps our footprints even when we forget to look back. The pen moved slowly across the page, steady and sure, as the last light faded over the fields. Behind her, through the open window, the faint ticking of the clock kept time with her heartbeat. Beyond the porch, the oak stood in quiet silhouette, its branches swaying gently as though acknowledging her words. The voices of the earth were silent now, but she could still feel them, steady, patient, eternal, and for the first time, she felt herself truly belong. The first chill of October crept into the nights, settling like breath against the windows. Mylan began lighting the fireplace again, its crackle filling the quiet rooms with a warmth that felt both comforting and melancholy. It was in those evenings, as the fire painted the walls gold, that she felt the house breathe again, not with ghosts, but with presence. Every object, every photograph on the mantel seemed to hold a pulse, as if time itself had slowed to listen. Her days took on a new rhythm. She still fed the chickens at sunrise, still fixed the small things that broke, the latch on the gate, the hinge of the tool shed, but something inside her had shifted. She was no longer living out of duty. Each task felt connected to something beyond her, something grounded in the same soil as the oak. The discovery of the box and the story of George and Elsie had awakened a tenderness she had long buried beneath practicality and habit. It wasn't nostalgia she felt now, but clarity. One afternoon, while clearing a shelf in her study, she came across a bundle of old letters tied with twine. Marcus's handwriting ran across the envelopes, familiar and patient. She had not read them in decades. For years she'd kept them sealed, afraid that reopening them might undo the fragile calm she had built after his death. But now, with the afternoon light falling across the desk and the scent of autumn drifting through the open window, she untied the string and began to read. The letters carried the same tone she remembered, steady, hopeful, threaded with longing. He had written about the jungle heat, about his men, about the small comforts that kept them human, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain on metal, and always at the end a promise. "I'll come home to you." She smiled softly, thinking how universal those words were. The same promise George had written to Elsie in another century, another war. The same hope and the same silence that followed. By the time she finished reading, The light had faded, and the first stars were blooming in the sky. She placed the letters back into their box, but left the lid open, as if to say she no longer needed to hide them. For the first time, she didn't feel the sharp edge of grief, only gratitude. The years she and Marcus had shared, though too few, had been real. And real things, she realized, never truly vanished. They only changed form, like leaves returning to the earth. That night, she wrote in her notebook. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate, the words coming not as confession but as understanding. She wrote about the oak, about the hidden door, about the way memory survives in the smallest things. Sometimes the land remembers for us, she wrote. When we forget, it keeps the stories until we are ready to find them again. She didn't know yet that those words would become the heart of the article she'd publish later, but she felt their truth as she wrote them. A few days later, she visited the church again. Pastor Thompson greeted her warmly, surprised to see her twice in 1 month after so many years of absence. "You've been busy," he said. "The Turner boy told me you're writing something about the Carter land." "Something like that," she replied. "I think it's time people remembered what came before them." He smiled. "You always had a teacher's heart. The Lord works in strange ways, doesn't he?" She nodded, though what she felt had less to do with heaven than with the simple grace of remembrance. She told him about George and Elsie. Not everything, but enough for him to understand. His eyes softened. "That's a good story to tell. There's a lot of folks these days who think history starts and ends with them." On her way home, she stopped by the Willow Bend Library to drop off a donation, a small stack of her old teaching books, and tucked between them a copy of the map she'd found with the word "us" written in faded pencil. She asked the librarian to place it with the local history collection. "Someone will want to see it someday," she said. "Maybe it'll mean something to them." That evening, she took her notebook to the porch and began drafting what would become her article. She wrote slowly, pausing often to look at the horizon. The story unfolded not as a mystery, but as a remembrance. She described the storm that had uncovered the door, the small relics inside, the photograph of George Reed, the letter signed by no one, but full of love. She wrote about the oak as a witness to human endurance, and about the way even the most ordinary lives could leave behind something extraordinary. The piece wasn't polished, but it was honest. When she finished, she mailed it to the editor of the Willow Bend Gazette with a short note. "For the local page, if you think it fits." Weeks passed, the days shortened, and the evenings came sooner, carrying the scent of smoke and rain. Mylan continued her routines, not expecting much from the newspaper. Then, one Friday morning, she went into town for supplies and saw it. The headline in modest type on the second page, "The Tree That Remembers." Beneath it was her story, her words laid out neatly between columns of town announcements and advertisements for feed and fertilizer. She stood for a long moment by the newsstand, reading the familiar sentences as though they had been written by someone else. The words looked different in print, smaller, quieter, but they carried the same weight she had felt when she'd written them. People in the store nodded politely as they passed her, some offering a brief smile. She didn't know if they'd read it yet, but it didn't matter. The story was out in the world now, breathing on its own. By the next week, something unexpected began to happen. Cars started stopping along the road that bordered her property. A few curious townsfolk came up to the oak, not to gawk, but to look, to stand quietly. Someone left a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. Another placed a folded note. Mylan watched from her kitchen window, astonished by how naturally it all began. It wasn't spectacle, it was reverence. Word had spread through the town, carried from neighbor to neighbor, and before long the oak had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. One afternoon, she walked out and found an elderly man kneeling by the roots, his hat in his hands. He stood when he saw her, embarrassed. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I hope you don't mind. My brother never came back from Korea. When I read your story, I thought maybe he'd like some company." She shook his hand and told him he was welcome any time. After he left, she knelt beside the tree herself and whispered a prayer. Not the kind she'd learned in church, but one of gratitude, simple and human. In the weeks that followed, more visitors came. Veterans, widows, children too young to understand loss, but old enough to feel its echo. They didn't stay long, but they left tokens, photographs, ribbons, notes with single names written in pencil. The base of the oak became a small mosaic of memory. Mylon tended it quietly, brushing away leaves, replacing wilted flowers with fresh ones from her garden. The place no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to everyone who had something to remember. In tending the oak, she began to heal. Each gesture, clearing debris, lighting a candle, reading the small messages left by strangers, stitched her own grief into something whole. She found herself smiling more, humming to herself while she worked. Even Rusty seemed to sense the change. He followed her around the yard, his tail wagging, his steps slower but sure. One crisp morning, she received a letter from the editor of the Gazette. He thanked her for her story and told her how many readers had written in about it. "You've given our town something it didn't know it needed," he wrote. "A place to remember." Enclosed with the letter was a small check, payment for her contribution. She laughed softly when she saw it, folded it neatly, and placed it inside her notebook. The money didn't matter. What mattered was the affirmation that her words had mattered. That night, as she sat by the fire, she reread her article. The words no longer felt like hers. They belonged to everyone who had read them, everyone who had found some piece of themselves reflected there. She thought of Elsie Carter and George Reed, their story now carried beyond the quiet hollow where it had been hidden for so long. Their love, once locked in silence, had become something living again, shared through her voice and through all those who now came to the oak. It was as if the earth itself had passed a story through her, asking her to speak on its behalf. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that flickered like memories. Mylon leaned back in her chair, feeling the warmth spread through her bones. She realized then that the ache in her chest, the emptiness that had followed her for decades, had changed. It was still there, but gentler now, transformed into something she could carry without breaking. It was not loss anymore. It was love remembered. She looked toward the window, where the dark outline of the oak was faintly visible against the moonlit field. It stood silent and eternal, holding the weight of countless lives without complaint. She raised her mug of tea toward it, a quiet toast to endurance, and whispered, "We're all still here." Winter crept into Willow Bend quietly that year, as if it didn't want to disturb what had begun to take root in the small town. The mornings were colder, the frost heavier on the fields, and the air had taken on that dry stillness that made every sound sharper. For Mylon, the change of season carried with it a strange mixture of solemnity and renewal. The oak, stripped of its leaves, stood exposed and magnificent against the pale sky. It had become something of a landmark now. People from neighboring counties occasionally drove down just to see it, to stand in front of that small door in its roots and whisper their thoughts into the wind. Some left tokens, others brought stories. And through it all, Mylan remained its quiet keeper. She never planned to be anyone's curator of memory, yet that was what she had become. Each morning, after feeding the animals, she would walk to the tree to make sure the offerings hadn't blown away, to brush off the frost that gathered on the wooden plaque she'd placed there herself. She hadn't expected the county to take notice, but they had. A week after her article in the Gazette, she received a letter from a local councilwoman asking permission to visit the property and discuss preservation. At first, Mylan hesitated. The oak wasn't meant to be a monument. It was simply a space of quiet remembrance. But she also knew that stories once shared belonged to the world. So she agreed. When the officials arrived, 2 women from the Cultural Heritage Committee and a young journalist with a camera. They were polite, almost reverent. They walked slowly around the oak, careful not to disturb the things people had left. The journalist asked gentle questions. How she'd found the door, how she'd discovered the history, what she thought it meant to the community. Mylan answered as best she could. She didn't embellish. She didn't turn it into legend. She simply told the truth, that she'd found a locked door, opened it, and discovered love preserved in metal and earth. After the visitors left, Mylan sat under the tree for a long time, listening to the wind move through its bare branches. She realized that the oak had become something beyond her own life now. It was no longer just a secret she'd uncovered or a comfort she'd claimed. It had become a gathering place for others who needed to believe that loss could still hold beauty. The thought filled her with a quiet satisfaction, but also with a trace of melancholy. She wondered whether George and Elsie, wherever their souls rested, would approve of what their story had become. Perhaps they would be surprised to know how far their love had traveled, beyond time, beyond their small patch of earth, into the hearts of strangers. By early December, the local paper ran another piece, this time written by the young journalist who had visited her. It was titled, "A Place to Remember." The article spoke of the oak as a living memorial, not just for one lost couple, but for everyone who had ever waited, grieved, or hoped for someone to return. The story was shared on the radio, then online. People began sending letters to the Gazette, and some addressed them directly to her. They wrote about their own lost loved ones, about wars that had taken brothers and sons, about the ways they'd found peace in remembering rather than forgetting. One woman enclosed a photograph of her husband from Vietnam, folded carefully with a note that simply said, "He never came back, but your story helped me breathe again." Mylan read each letter slowly, letting the words settle into her. She placed them all in a small wooden box that she kept by her bed. Every one of them was a thread connecting her to lives she would never meet, and together they formed a tapestry of human endurance. Sometimes she would bring a few of the letters to the oak and read them aloud in a soft voice, as if sharing them with the spirits that lingered there. The wind would rise through the branches as she spoke, and though she knew it was only the weather, part of her liked to think that the tree was listening. A few days before Christmas, Pastor Thompson called. The church planned to hold a candlelight vigil in honor of veterans and those lost to war, and he asked if they could hold it at the Oak. Mylan hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The night of the vigil, people gathered from all over the county. Dozens of small lights dotted the field, flickering gently against the darkness. The air was cold enough to make each breath visible, and the sound of the crowd was hushed, reverent. Children clutched candles, veterans stood with bowed heads, and families pressed close together. Pastor Thompson spoke softly about remembrance, about how faith and memory were not opposites, but companions. When he finished, he gestured for Mylan to come forward. She hadn't planned to speak, but as she stepped toward the oak, the faces turned toward her with quiet expectation. She felt her heart thud once, hard, then settle. "This tree has been here longer than any of us," she said, her voice steady in the cold air. "It's seen joy and sorrow, war and peace, life and loss. I think it stands here to remind us that even when time moves on, love doesn't disappear. It changes form, but it stays. It stays in the land, in the air, in the people who remember." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the crowd. "If you've come here tonight to remember someone, know that they are remembered. And that matters." No one clapped. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. Then, one by one, people stepped forward, placing their candles at the base of the tree until the ground glowed with a soft, trembling light. Mylan stood among them, feeling the warmth rise in her chest, spreading outward like the fire's reflection in a dark room. For the first time in years, she did not feel alone. The following morning, frost had settled on the candles, their wax hardened into small sculptures of memory. She walked among them, brushing away the ice, smiling at the names written on small scraps of paper tucked beneath the wax. Some she recognized from the letters she'd received. Others were new. She didn't need to know their stories. The act of remembrance itself was enough. Over the next weeks, the county council worked quietly to preserve the site. A small stone marker was installed near the tree, engraved with simple words, "In memory of those we waited for and loved." The plaque did not mention names or dates. It didn't need to. It belonged to everyone. Mylan watched the workers place it with care, tamping down the soil around its base. When they left, she stood there alone for a while, reading the inscription again and again until it seemed to echo in her bones. By January, letters began arriving from farther away, places she had never visited, names she didn't recognize. People sent photographs, postcards, even small keepsakes. One came from a man in New York who had lost his wife in the attacks of September 11th. Another from a woman in Georgia who wrote, "My mother used to tell me that love outlasts memory. I think your oak proves her right." Each message humbled her. She had thought the story would end in her small town, but it had grown wings. The Gazette asked to interview her again, this time for a national piece. When the reporter came, she was younger than Mylan expected, barely 30, full of the restless energy of people who chase stories. She asked all the usual questions, but then she said something that stayed with Mylan long after she'd left. "You know," the reporter said, "there are memorials everywhere, statues, parks, cemeteries, but none of them feel like this. Maybe it's because this one started from kindness instead of tragedy." Mylan didn't answer right away. She looked at the oak, its bare limbs stretching against the pale sky, and thought of all the hands that had left flowers there. "Maybe it's because it started with love," she finally said. The story spread farther after that. It wasn't a sensation. It didn't go viral the way modern stories often did, but it lingered, steady and enduring, like the tree itself. People spoke of the Oak of Memory, and travelers who passed through Willow Bend sometimes took a short detour to see it. The town, once quiet and overlooked, began to take pride in its history again. The library's small local history section expanded. Children learned about the Carters in school. A teacher even assigned her article to a class as an example of living history. For Mylan, life returned to its gentle rhythm, but the rhythm was richer now. Each morning when she stepped outside, the world seemed to hum with a quiet significance. The air tasted cleaner, the light softer. Even the loneliness that had once felt like a second skin had begun to loosen its hold. She knew Marcus would have smiled at what she had done. He had always believed that even the smallest act of care could ripple outward and touch lives she'd never know. He had been right. One evening in late February, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, a car pulled up by the gate. A young couple stepped out, carrying a small bundle of flowers. They waved shyly and asked if they might visit the oak. "Of course," she said. As they walked across the field, their hands clasped tightly, Mylan realized they couldn't have been more than 20. She watched them kneel at the base of the tree, the man whispering something into the woman's ear before placing the flowers among the others. When they turned to leave, the woman paused and said, "It's beautiful what you've done here. It gives people hope." Mylan smiled and replied, "It wasn't me. It was the people who came before. I just happened to listen." That night, as the stars emerged one by one, she opened her notebook and added a final line to her collection of thoughts. "Love is not buried. It takes root." The words came easily, and when she closed the book, she felt an unfamiliar fullness inside her. The story of the oak had spread beyond her, beyond Willow Bend, beyond even the memory of George and Elsie. But its heart remained the same. It was a story about what endures when everything else fades, about how remembrance itself can be an act of love. And though she could not have known it then, the seeds of what would happen next, the town's memorial ceremony, the letters from strangers, the quiet visits that would continue for years, had already been planted in that cold winter soil. All she had to do now was let them grow. The last traces of winter melted away as February slipped quietly into March, and the land around Willow Bend began to stir again. The air lost its sharp edge, the soil softened, and the first pale shoots of grass broke through the frost-hardened ground. Mylan felt the change before she saw it, a subtle easing in the mornings, a faint hum of renewal in the world around her. The oak stood as it always had, timeless, its branches reaching towards the slowly warming sky. Yet there was something gentler in its presence now, as though it too sensed that a long silence had been lifted. For months, she had tended to the small memorial as a part of her daily life. What had begun as an accidental discovery had turned into something living, a place that breathed through the people who visited it. Sometimes she would step outside before dawn and see the faint glow of candles flickering among the roots. The sight no longer startled her. It comforted her. The oak had become what it was always meant to be, a keeper of memory, a resting place not for bodies but for feelings that refused to die. The county had finished installing a simple wooden bench near the tree, and on warm days Mylan often sat there with a cup of tea, reading letters from strangers. The stories that reached her mailbox were countless, notes of gratitude, fragments of lives shared with her as though she were a confidant. They came from soldiers' widows, from children who had lost parents, from people who had never set foot in Alabama, but felt connected to a story of love that endured across time. She never answered them all, but she kept each one, stacking them neatly in an old trunk by her bed. They were reminders that the smallest acts, a letter, a door opened, a truth uncovered, could ripple farther than anyone might imagine. Spring sunlight returned the color to her world. Her small farm began to bloom again. The hens resumed their lazy rhythm of laying, and even Rusty, now older and slower, spent long afternoons sprawled in the shade, content to nap near her feet. Life felt measured but full, and for the first time in many years, Mylan felt no separation between herself and the world around her. She was no longer the woman who merely endured her days. She was part of something larger, a quiet chain of remembrance that stretched back before her and would continue long after she was gone. The morning that began her final visit to the oak was bright and windless. The air carried the faint scent of honeysuckle from the edge of the property. She walked across the field slowly, savoring the crunch of soil beneath her boots. Her steps followed the same path she had taken countless times, yet it felt different that day. Perhaps it was the light, soft, almost golden, or perhaps it was the sense of closure that had begun to form in her heart, though she hadn't yet found words for it. When she reached the oak, she noticed that someone had recently left a bouquet of fresh wildflowers tied with a strip of ribbon. Beneath them lay a folded piece of paper weighted by a small stone. Mylan lifted it carefully, her hands trembling slightly despite the warmth of the morning. The note was written in careful lupin handwriting. "Thank you for keeping this place alive. My grandmother used to tell me about Elsie Carter. I never believed she was real until now." Mylan smiled as she folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. The world had changed so much since Elsie's time, and yet the simple human need to be remembered remained constant. In that moment, she understood that she was no longer the guardian of one story, but of many. Each person who came here had brought a piece of their own heart, leaving behind traces of love, regret, hope. The oak had become a mosaic of collective memory, and she, merely one of its caretakers, was honored to have played her part. She sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, and let her gaze drift upward through the vast canopy. The branches swayed gently, their motion slow and rhythmic, like breathing. The sunlight filtered through the early leaves, casting moving patterns across the ground. The world felt alive in a way that no words could capture. For a while, she simply listened, to the birds, to the wind, to the faint creak of the old wood as it stretched. Then, almost without realizing, she began to speak loud, her voice low and steady. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "It wasn't about finding something hidden. It was about remembering what was never truly lost." The words came easily, carried away by the breeze. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular, not to George or Elsie, not even to Marcus. She was speaking to the land itself, to the silent witness that had sheltered all their stories. The ground beneath her feet felt firm and forgiving, the kind of strength that didn't demand acknowledgement. It simply existed, as constant as love itself. The following weeks passed quietly. People still came to the oak, though the crowds grew smaller as the novelty faded and the story settled into local legend. The town moved on, as towns always do, but the tree remained, its roots deep, its door still closed, guarding what it had always guarded. Mylan continued to visit, but less frequently now. She no longer felt the need to check on it every day. It was in good hands, the hands of time, of nature, of all those who had left something of themselves there. In April, the Gazette ran a short follow-up piece, this time written by a local teacher who had brought her students to see the oak. The article ended with a line that made Mylan smile. "Some stories don't belong in books. They belong in the ground, in the trees, in the hearts of the people who walk among them." It was a sentiment she understood better than anyone. The oak had taught her that history wasn't something trapped in the past. It was a living conversation between those who came before and those who remained. That evening, she sat on her porch with her journal and began to write one final entry. Her handwriting had grown slower, the lines a little uneven, but her thoughts were clear. "If someone finds this one day," she wrote, "I hope they know that love can outlast silence. That remembering is a kind of forgiveness. That life, no matter how ordinary, leaves its mark on the earth." She paused, looking out across the field where twilight was gathering, the first stars trembling above the horizon. Then she added one last line. "I have found peace beneath the oak." Weeks turned into months. The summer heat returned, pressing heavy over the land. The grass grew tall, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. Mylan spent most afternoons inside, resting in the cool shade of her living room. Her hair had gone entirely white now, her hands thinner and lined with the fine etchings of time, but her eyes still held that same quiet spark of strength. The town had grown fond of her. Neighbors often stopped by with food or small gifts, and children sometimes came to hear her tell the story of the tree. She told it simply, without embellishment, always ending with the same words, "The earth keeps what we give it." One morning in late July, when the sun was already high and the air shimmered with heat, she walked to the oak again. Rusty was gone by then. He'd passed peacefully in his sleep a few weeks earlier, and she felt his absence keenly, though she told herself he was part of the land now, too. The field buzzed with life, dragonflies darting through the air, the scent of wildflowers thick and sweet. As she approached the tree, she saw that the offerings had changed again. There were new flowers, a small wooden cross carved by hand, and a note that simply read, "For those who loved deeply." She sat beneath the tree for a long time that day, her back resting against the rough bark. She closed her eyes and listened to the hum of summer all around her. The air was warm on her face, the earth solid beneath her. She thought of George and Elsie, of Marcus, of all the people whose names she had read in letters and of those she would never know. The boundaries between their lives and hers had dissolved long ago. What remained was something whole and wordless, a quiet understanding that love and memory were not opposites, but the same thing seen from different sides of time. When the sun began to lower, she stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt. She placed her hand against the tree one last time, feeling its deep, slow heartbeat beneath the bark. "Thank you," she whispered. It was not a farewell, but an acknowledgement, a promise kept between two living things that had learned to listen to one another. The seasons turned once more. Autumn returned with its golds and reds, and the oak's branches blazed with color before shedding their leaves again. Mylan no longer came to the field as often. Age and the quiet pull of time had begun to anchor her more firmly to her home. Yet, whenever she looked out her window, she could still see the outline of the tree against the horizon, and that was enough. When she passed away the following spring, the town mourned her gently. The funeral was small, attended by neighbors, friends, and a few strangers who had read her story and felt they owed her a debt of gratitude. The pastor spoke of her as a teacher, a storyteller, a keeper of memory. After the service, some of the townsfolk drove to her property and laid flowers beneath the oak. The bench remained there, weathered but sturdy, and the plaque gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The small door in the roots was still closed, its lock untouched, its secret intact. Years later, long after her house had been sold and her name had faded from everyday conversation, the oak still stood. The field had grown wilder, the path more overgrown, but people still came, fewer now, yet always quietly. They brought their memories, their griefs, their hopes. And sometimes, on still days when the light slanted just right, it seemed as if the air itself carried her presence, calm, steady, eternal. The wind moved through the branches, whispering across the fields, and the oak answered in kind, a deep murmur, low and endless. Beneath its roots lay the stories of the forgotten, the loved, the waiting. And in that silence, rich and infinite, the world kept its promise. Nothing loved was ever truly lost. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. There are more real-life mysteries waiting for you right here. Watch the next video. It'll change the way you see the world. And if you know someone who'd love this story, share it with them. Let them feel it too.